If you want to understand whether a narcissist truly loves you, stop listening to what they say and start watching what they cannot help but do. Because here is the paradox that sits at the very center of narcissistic attachment: possession without commitment. They will guard you like something precious and yet refuse to ever call you theirs. Watch closely, and you will see it. A flicker of discomfort when someone else compliments you. A subtle shift in tone when your attention drifts elsewhere in a room. A question disguised as casual about who you were with last night. This is not indifference. Indifference does not track. Indifference does not notice. What you are witnessing is a nervous system that is quietly, involuntarily, keeping tabs on someone it cannot afford to lose, while a mind, layered in defense, insists to itself that it doesn't need anyone at all. This is where we have to understand narcissism, not as coldness, but as a survival strategy built in childhood, often in homes, where love was conditional, where a child learned early that being truly seen was dangerous, that vulnerability invited rejection or control. So the child built a self that performed strength, that needed nothing, that could not be hurt, because it never let anyone close enough to hurt it. And that child grew up, but the nervous system did not forget. It still knows, somewhere underneath the performance, what it feels like to want someone. It just no longer has language for it. It only has behavior. And so what you get, in adulthood, is a person who will not claim you, because claiming requires admitting need, and need was never safe, but who cannot stop orbiting you either. They show up in the small, involuntary tells, the possessiveness without the promise, the jealousy without the vulnerability of saying, "I'm scared of losing you." Instead, what comes out is control. What comes out is a joke that isn't really a joke. What comes out is a subtle attempt to keep you close, dressed up as indifference, dressed up as power. This is important because so many people mistake this behavior for manipulation alone, or for a game, and sometimes it is. But underneath it, more often than we're taught to believe, is something rawer, an old, unprocessed terror of abandonment, wearing the mask of control. The narcissist is not free from attachment. They are, in many cases, drowning in it, while simultaneously unable to admit it exists. So when you see this pattern, the possessiveness that never becomes commitment, the watching that never becomes admission, understand what you are actually looking at. You are looking at love that has been so distorted by early wounding that it can no longer speak its own name. Not love as most of us were taught to recognize it, but love, nonetheless, trapped inside a nervous system that learned, long before you ever met them, that wanting someone out loud was the most dangerous thing a person could do. And this is the tragedy underneath the behavior. The very defenses that once protected them as a child are now the same walls keeping them from the one thing they quietly, desperately want: to be loved without having to risk saying so. So if the possessiveness is real, if the attachment is real, then the question becomes obvious. Why can't they just say it? Why does a person who clearly feels something choose silence, deflection, even cruelty, over 3 simple words? And the answer takes us somewhere deeper than personality. It takes us into the architecture of the nervous system itself. To understand this, we have to go back, not judgmentally, but honestly, to what attachment researchers like Bowlby taught us decades ago. A child does not arrive in this world knowing how to love safely. That capacity is built, or it is broken, in the earliest relationships a child has. When a caregiver is attuned, present, responsive, the child learns that needing someone is safe, that closeness will be met with closeness. But when a caregiver is inconsistent, dismissive, or worse, when love is doled out conditionally, tied to performance or obedience or the caregiver's own emotional state, the child learns something very different. The child learns that need is dangerous, that wanting someone, openly, is the fastest route to being hurt. This is where Winnicott's work becomes essential. He wrote about the false self, a self constructed not from authentic experience, but from what was necessary to survive an environment that could not tolerate the child's real, vulnerable emotional life. And this is precisely what we see in narcissistic development. The true self, the part capable of saying, "I love you and I'm terrified of what that means," gets buried, not destroyed, buried. And in its place rises a false self, a performance of invulnerability, a self that cannot be rejected because it never asks for anything in the first place. So when a narcissist refuses to say the words, understand what's actually happening beneath the surface. It is not that the feeling is absent. It is that saying it out loud would require dismantling the very structure that has kept them safe since childhood. To say I love you is to say I need you. And to a nervous system wired in infancy to associate need with danger, that sentence doesn't feel like intimacy. It feels like annihilation. It feels like handing someone the exact weapon that was once used against them. This is the tragic logic of narcissistic defense. The silence isn't cold, it's protective. Misguided, yes. Painful for the people who love them, absolutely. But protective in the same way a burned hand instinctively pulls away from fire long after the fire itself is gone. And this is why the words never come, even when everything else, the possessiveness, the attention, the subtle ways they orbit your life, tells a different story. Because the mouth is guarded by defenses the heart never agreed to. What lives underneath cannot always reach the surface. Not because it isn't real, but because reaching the surface was never safe. So if you're waiting for a narcissist to confess love in language, you may be waiting for a permission their own nervous system never learned how to give. The love is not missing. It is buried beneath a lifetime of learning that wanting someone out loud was never safe to do. There is another sign, quieter than jealousy, subtler than silence, and yet once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Watch what happens to a narcissist's language over time, when they are truly attached to someone. Watch their preferences. Watch the small cultural fingerprints of who they are, and you will notice something strange. They start to blur. Your phrases start coming out of their mouth. Your opinions start appearing in their arguments, spoken with the same conviction they once reserved only for their own. The show you introduce them to becomes their favorite. The way you take your coffee becomes the way they take theirs. This is not coincidence, and it is not flattery in the way we usually understand it. To make sense of this, we have to turn to Heinz Kohut and his idea of the self-object. Kohut proposed that some people, particularly those whose early sense of self was never fully allowed to solidify, use other people not as separate, autonomous beings to relate to, but as extensions of their own psychological structure. A self-object is someone who performs a function the self cannot yet perform on its own, and for a person with a fragile, narcissistically organized identity, the people they love most become exactly this. Not companions, regulators, mirrors, missing pieces. This is why the mimicry happens. It's not a conscious decision to copy you. It is something closer to psychological osmosis. Because on some level, being close to you regulates something in them that was never properly built. Your steadiness becomes their steadiness. Your certainty becomes borrowed certainty. And so, without ever admitting it, without ever being able to admit it, they begin to construct themselves partially out of you. And here is where it becomes almost unbearably poignant, if you allow yourself to really sit with it. This mimicry, this quiet absorption of your identity into theirs, is one of the most intimate things a narcissist is capable of doing. Not because it is healthy, it is not. Real intimacy requires two distinct selves choosing closeness. But in its distorted way, this mirroring is the closest thing their defended psyche allows to fusion, to closeness, to love. They cannot say, "You have become important to me." So instead, without realizing it, they simply become a little more like you. This is also why losing you, for a narcissist who has done this, is so much more destabilizing than they let on, because it isn't just losing a partner. On some unconscious level, it is losing a piece of the self they had quietly, secretly built around you. This is part of why the devaluation, the anger, the chaos that so often follows a breakup with a narcissist is so disproportionate. They are not just grieving you. They are grieving a structure of identity that depended on your presence to hold together. So when you notice a narcissist absorbing your language, your habits, your way of seeing the world, do not mistake this for shallow imitation. You are watching someone, in the only way their wounded psyche knows how, try to keep you permanently close by making you part of who they are. And now we arrive at the pattern that confuses people more than almost any other. The push, followed by the pull. The withdrawal, followed by the sudden, urgent return. Most people call this manipulation and stop there. But if we stop there, we miss something important, because underneath the chaos of this behavior is a question the narcissist is asking over and over in the only language they have access to. Will you actually stay? Think about what it means to grow up, never trusting that love was stable. Not love that had to be earned through performance. Not love that vanished the moment you expressed a need. Not love that was withdrawn as punishment. If that was your early experience, then somewhere in your nervous system, a belief calcified. Closeness is temporary, and abandonment is only ever one mistake away. This belief does not stay in childhood. It follows a person into every adult relationship they will ever have, quietly running in the background, shaping behavior long before conscious thought ever catches up. So when a narcissist pushes you away, with coldness, with cruelty, with sudden distance that seems to come from nowhere, understand that on some level, this is often an unconscious test. Not a cruel game for its own sake, though it can certainly feel that way, and the pain it causes is real and valid. But underneath it, the question being asked is this: if I stop performing, if I become difficult, if I show you my worst, will you still be here? Will you finally prove what I already secretly believe, that everyone eventually leaves? This is the tragic irony at the heart of narcissistic relational patterns. The very behavior meant to test loyalty is often the exact behavior that destroys it. Because most people, reasonably, do not stay through repeated devaluation. They leave. And when they leave, the narcissist experiences it not as the natural consequence of their own actions, but as confirmation of the deepest wound they carry. Proof, once again, that they were never enough to be loved unconditionally. This is not an excuse for cruelty. It never is. Push-pull behavior can cause real damage, and naming its origin does not mean tolerating its impact. But understanding it changes what you're looking at. You are not simply looking at someone playing games with your emotions for sport. You are looking at someone reenacting an old, unhealed fear, using you as the unwitting stage for a question they were never able to ask directly as a child. Am I safe to need you? And this is where the philosophical weight of this pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Because what looks like control is often terror, wearing control's clothing. What looks like indifference is often vigilance, dressed up to look like strength. The narcissist pulls away not because they feel nothing, but because feeling too much for too long, without a guarantee of safety, has always felt unbearable. So the next time you witness this pattern, the sudden distance, the equally sudden return, recognize it for what it so often is. Not proof of a person who doesn't care, but proof of a person who cares so much they have never learned how to trust it will be enough to keep you. There is a moment that tells you almost everything about how deeply a narcissist has become attached. And it isn't in the silence. It's in what happens after the silence breaks. Because with people who feel little, distance tends to stay distance. It fades quietly, without urgency, without disruption. But with someone who has been quietly consumed by attachment they can't name, the silence eventually cracks under its own weight. And when it does, the return is rarely calm. It's charged, it's fast, it's almost involuntary. Notice the shift over time, if you've experienced this pattern. In the beginning, the withdrawal periods after conflict are longer. The narcissist can disappear for days, weeks, seemingly unaffected, treating the disconnection as though it costs them nothing. But watch what happens the deeper the attachment grows. The silences get shorter, the return gets more urgent. And crucially, the tone of the return changes. It stops being transactional, stops being about what they need from you in that moment, and starts becoming something closer to desperation, dressed up as nonchalance. This is where we have to understand what psychologists call hoovering, not as a single manipulative tactic, but as a spectrum of behavior that reveals, almost like a diagnostic tool, how much emotional gravity a person actually holds over the narcissist's internal world. Early hoovering tends to be strategic, calculated, a test of control, a way of restoring narrative dominance after feeling exposed. But as real attachment deepens, something shifts underneath the strategy. The return stops being purely about power and starts being about relief. about the flood of nervous system regulation that comes only from re-establishing contact with the one person who has become, without their permission, essential to their internal equilibrium. This is important because it reframes what so many people misread as inconsistency or chaos. The unpredictability isn't randomness. It's a nervous system oscillating between two competing terrors, the terror of closeness, which threatens exposure, and the terror of distance, which threatens loss. Neither state can be tolerated for long. So the narcissist swings between them, not out of malice alone, but because their internal architecture was never built to hold steady, secure attachment in the first place. Nobody taught them how to stay close without feeling engulfed, or how to create distance without feeling abandoned. So they oscillate, and the frequency of that oscillation tells you exactly how much you matter. This is also why, paradoxically, the moments right after a narcissist reaches back out are often the moments where you glimpse the most unguarded version of them. The mask slips, briefly, before it reassembles. There's an urgency in the message, a rawness in the tone, that doesn't fit the practiced indifference they perform the rest of the time. That urgency is not strategy. That urgency is a nervous system that has, for a moment, lost the ability to pretend it doesn't need what it just lost access to. None of this excuses the instability or asks you to accept a relationship defined by this rhythm. But it does answer the question so many people ask in the aftermath of these cycles. Why do they keep coming back if they don't care? They come back because the silence became unbearable, for reasons they cannot yet articulate, even to themselves. The frequency of return is not noise, it's a signal, and the faster it happens, the louder it's telling you exactly how much they were never able to say out loud. Now watch what happens the moment you actually begin to pull away. Not the performative distance a narcissist creates to test you, but real detachment, the quiet, internal kind, where you stop chasing, stop explaining yourself, stop trying to earn your way back into their approval. This is where the mask tends to slip fastest, and what emerges from underneath it tells you almost everything. Most people expect indifference to be met with indifference. If they don't care, why would your withdrawal provoke anything at all? And yet, so often, what actually surfaces is not calm. It's panic, dressed up as anger, a sudden intensity that seems wildly disproportionate to the situation. Accusations, escalation, an almost frantic need to regain control of the narrative before you fully slip out of reach. To understand this, we have to look at what real detachment threatens in a narcissistically organized psyche. Because for most of us, a relationship ending is painful, but survivable, a loss that fits within a coherent sense of self. But for someone whose identity has been partially built around being needed, admired, or in control of how another person sees them, your detachment isn't just relational loss. It's a direct threat to the structure of self they have spent a lifetime constructing. If you stop reacting, stop needing their approval, stop orbiting their moods, the story they have told themselves about their own significance in your life begins to collapse. And that collapse is precisely what their entire defense system was built to prevent. This is where the philosopher and the clinician start to agree, if you listen closely to both. What we are witnessing in that eruption of anger is not strength. It is the sound of a false self encountering the one thing it was never built to withstand: irrelevance. Narcissistic defenses can tolerate conflict. They can tolerate even hatred, because hatred still means you are thinking about them, still means they occupy space in your inner world. What they cannot tolerate is indifference. Being forgotten is a fate more threatening than being resented, because resentment still confirms significance, and significance is the only currency their fragile self-structure has ever learned to trade in. So, the anger you see when you finally, genuinely pull away is rarely really about you, and rarely really about whatever surface issue triggers it. It is the panic of a person watching their sense of narrative control slip through their fingers in real time. And panic, when it cannot be named or processed consciously, almost always converts into aggression. This is not an excuse, it is an explanation. The distinction matters because it lets you see the behavior clearly without either villainizing it beyond recognition or excusing the harm it can cause. What's important for you to understand, if you're on the receiving end of this, is what this reaction actually confirms. Calm indifference does not escalate. Only investment escalates. The intensity of their response to your withdrawal is, in its own distorted way, a confession, not one they would ever consciously make, but a confession nonetheless that your presence mattered more than their behavior ever allowed them to show. So when you see panic wearing the mask of anger, recognize it for what it is. Not proof that you were never valued, but proof of exactly how much your absence was something they were never prepared to survive. There is a version of a narcissist that almost no one gets to see. Not the one who performs confidence in a room full of people. Not the one who deflects, who charms, who controls the frame of every conversation. There is another version, rarer, quieter, that only surfaces in private, usually late at night, usually unexpectedly, and usually gone again before morning. If you have ever witnessed it, you know exactly what I mean. And if you have, you likely spent a long time afterward wondering which version was real. The answer, and this is important, is both, but only one of them is safe to show the world. To understand this, we have to return to the idea of the false self, but push it a little further than we did earlier. Winnicott didn't describe the false self as a lie, exactly. He described it as a necessary adaptation, a shield built to protect something more fragile underneath. And the true self does not disappear simply because it has been buried. It remains, intact in some form, waiting for conditions safe enough to let it briefly surface. For most narcissistically defended people, those conditions almost never arrive. The world is too unpredictable, too full of potential rejection for the mask to ever fully come down. But in rare moments, in the dark, in private, with someone whose presence has, over time, started to feel less like a threat and more like safety, something shifts. The performance gets exhausting to maintain. And for a few unguarded minutes, what leaks out is not control, not charm, not superiority. It's fear. Sometimes grief. Sometimes a kind of tenderness that seems almost foreign coming from them, as though they are speaking in a language they've forgotten they know. This is one of the most disorienting experiences for anyone who loves a narcissist, because it creates a kind of psychological whiplash. You saw something real. You know you did. And then, often within hours, it's gone, replaced by the usual armor, sometimes replaced by outright denial that the moment ever happened at all. This isn't necessarily deception. More often, it's shame. The false self experiences its own vulnerability as a kind of failure, a breach in the wall it depends on for survival. And so it moves quickly to seal the crack back up, sometimes by pretending the crack was never there. But here is what matters. That moment was not fake. Vulnerability cannot be performed convincingly by a psyche that has spent a lifetime avoiding it. What you witnessed in that unguarded window was the true self, the one buried under decades of necessary armor, reaching, briefly, toward the surface. It happened because something about your presence, even if they could never say it directly, felt safer than the world usually feels to them. This is why those private moments carry so much weight, even when they're followed by retreat. They are proof that the capacity for real feeling was never destroyed. Only hidden, only waiting for a version of safety most of the world will never be allowed to offer them. So if you've seen that version, even once, the cracked mask, the unguarded voice, understand what you witnessed, not weakness, not manipulation, the rarest thing a narcissist has to give, a glimpse of who they were before the world taught them. It wasn't safe to be that person out loud. Pay attention to what a narcissist remembers, not just to what they say. Because language can be curated, rehearsed, weaponized even, to project exactly the image of indifference they want you to believe. But memory is harder to fake. Memory reveals where attention has actually been living, whether or not the person wants to admit it. You'll notice this most clearly months after they've claimed not to care anymore. They'll reference a story you told them once, in passing, that you barely remember telling. They'll know the name of your coworker, the date of an appointment you mentioned only briefly, the small detail of a childhood memory you shared in a completely different context. And they'll do this while maintaining, often quite convincingly, that you no longer matter to them at all. This contradiction isn't an accident, And it isn't really a contradiction at all, once you understand how attention and attachment actually function beneath conscious awareness. What we give our sustained, detailed memory to is rarely a neutral process. The brain doesn't file away information indiscriminately. It prioritizes what feels significant, what carries emotional weight, what the nervous system has flagged, often without our permission, as important to track. This is true for all of us. It is especially true, though, for someone whose sense of safety has always depended on monitoring the people closest to them. So when a narcissist retains this level of detail about your life, long after they've claimed emotional distance, what you're actually seeing is a kind of unconscious surveillance, born not from calculation, but from attachment that never fully disengaged. Their conscious mind may have constructed an entire narrative around no longer caring. But their memory, operating beneath that narrative, tells a different story. One where you were never actually filed away as unimportant, no matter what they said out loud. This is worth sitting with, because it exposes something essential about how narcissistic defense actually works. It is not that feeling disappears. It's that feeling gets relocated, pushed beneath a layer of conscious denial, while continuing to operate quietly in the background. The false self insists it has moved on. But underneath, the true self is still tracking, still cataloging, still holding on to details it was never given permission to discard. And this is where the philosophical weight of memory becomes impossible to ignore. What we remember, in the end, is a map of what mattered to us, whether we intended it to be or not. A person genuinely indifferent to you does not retain the texture of your life in this kind of detail. Indifference forgets. Indifference lets details dissolve, because nothing in the nervous system flagged them as worth keeping. But investment remembers. Investment holds on, quietly, stubbornly, even when the conscious mind has been instructed to let go. So if you've noticed a narcissist recalling details they claim not to care about, understand what you're actually witnessing, not confusion, not inconsistency. A memory system that was never told to stop paying attention to you, because somewhere, beneath the performance of indifference, it never actually did. There is a shift that happens in a narcissist's cruelty over time, and if you've lived through it, you already know it in your body before your mind ever put language to it. Early on, the insults are generic, surface level, the kind of thing that could be said to almost anyone. Comments about appearance, intelligence, worth, the standard currency of devaluation. But the longer someone stays close to a narcissist, the more that cruelty changes shape. It stops being generic. It starts becoming precise, and that precision is not incidental. It is, in its own dark way, a form of intimacy. To understand this, we have to be honest about what cruelty actually requires to land with maximum damage. A stranger cannot truly wound you, not deeply, not in the places that matter, because a stranger does not know where those places are. Precision cruelty requires information. It requires having listened, at some point, closely enough to know exactly which insecurity sits closest to the surface, which childhood wound was disclosed in a vulnerable moment, which fear you tried to bury, but accidentally revealed. A narcissist who has truly bonded with you has collected this information, not necessarily with conscious, malicious intent at the time, but simply by paying the kind of close, sustained attention that real attachment produces. And this is the disturbing paradox we have to sit with. The same intimacy that allows deep love also, in a wounded psyche, provides the blueprint for devastating harm. Knowing someone deeply gives you the capacity to comfort them with uncanny accuracy, and the capacity to destroy them with the exact same accuracy. In a securely attached person, that knowledge gets used, almost exclusively, to nurture. In a narcissistically defended person, particularly one who feels threatened, abandoned, or exposed, that same knowledge can get weaponized instead. Not because the love was never real, but because the psychological architecture holding it was never stable enough to keep intimacy from curdling into control when threatened. This is important, because it reframes something people often misread as proof of hatred. The specificity of the cruelty is not evidence that the connection was fake. In many cases, it's the opposite. It's evidence of exactly how closely they were paying attention while the connection was real. Generic insults come from people who never truly knew you. Precise, targeted wounds come from people who did, and who are now using that knowledge as a weapon, because vulnerability, love, and fear have become so tangled inside them that they no longer know how to express one without the others leaking through. None of this excuses the harm. Precision cruelty can leave wounds that take years to unlearn, and naming its psychological root is not the same as tolerating its presence in your life. But understanding it changes what you're looking at in the aftermath. You are not looking at someone who never cared enough to know you. You are looking at someone who knew you intimately, and whose defenses converted that intimacy into a weapon the moment they felt exposed, threatened, or afraid of losing control. So when the cruelty becomes personal instead of generic, recognize the uncomfortable truth hiding inside it. That precision could only ever come from closeness. And closeness, however distorted its expression became, was never something a truly indifferent person would have bothered to build, which brings us, finally, to the truth underneath everything we've explored today. If you take only one thing from this speech, let it be this. A narcissist does not fear your anger. They do not fear your tears, your accusations, even your hatred. All of these, in their own distorted internal economy, still mean something. They still mean you are thinking about them. They still mean they occupy space in your mind. What a narcissist actually fears, more than anything else you could ever direct at them, is your indifference. Being forgotten terrifies them in a way that being hated never could. This sounds strange at first, until you understand what significance means to a psyche built the way theirs was built. From very early on, many narcissistically organized people learned a painful lesson before they had the language to understand it. Being loved unconditionally was never guaranteed. But being noticed, being reacted to, being impossible to ignore, that could be manufactured. That could be controlled. And so, over time, significance became a substitute for love. Not because it felt as good, but because it felt achievable, in a way that vulnerable, unconditional love never did. This is why hatred to a narcissist is almost bearable. Hatred confirms they still matter. It confirms they are still occupying the emotional center of your world, even in a painful, distorted form. But indifference offers no such confirmation. Indifference tells them the truth they have spent their entire life defending against. That they are replaceable, forgettable, ordinary. And to a self that was never allowed to feel securely valuable, simply for existing, ordinary is unbearable. Ordinary is the wound underneath every mask we've talked about today. This is where all 10 of these signs finally converge into a single understanding. The possessiveness without commitment. The silence that hides unspeakable need. The mimicry that quietly absorbs your identity. The push and pull that tests whether you'll stay. The hoovering that accelerates the deeper the attachment grows. The panic disguised as anger the moment you truly detach. The rare, unguarded moments where the true self briefly surfaces. The memory that refuses to let go, even when the mouth insists otherwise. The cruelty that becomes precise instead of generic. All of it points toward the same conclusion. This is a person who feels far more than they can ever safely express, defended by a structure built so early and so necessarily that dismantling it now would feel like dismantling survival itself. None of this is an instruction to stay. Understanding the psychology behind narcissistic behavior does not obligate you to absorb its cost indefinitely. You are allowed to recognize the wound and still protect yourself from what that wound produces when left unhealed. Compassion and boundaries were never meant to be opposites. But there is something quietly transformative in finally understanding what you lived through. In knowing that the coldness was never really coldness. That the silence was never really absence. That underneath the armor, there was a frightened, wounded version of a person who never learned how to want someone out loud without feeling like it would destroy them. And perhaps that is the final truth worth carrying with you. Love, even when it is broken, distorted, defended beyond recognition, does not disappear. It simply goes into hiding, waiting for a kind of safety most narcissists will spend their entire lives too afraid to ever fully feel again.